On my honeymoon, I got to go to Hawaii, and we did something that maybe some of you have done before, and that is we went to the top of Mount Haleakala to see the sunrise. It's one of the highest points. It's a dormant volcano, and so the opportunity to see the sunrise over the Pacific Ocean was enough to get me out of bed really early in the morning and to the top of Mount Haleakala in the dark before the sun rose. So we got up there. My husband and I were there, and there were some other people there who were doing the same thing that we were, coming to see the sunrise. And we got up there cold, hadn't really prepared to have cold weather on my honeymoon, and we waited. So I knew I was standing there facing the right direction. I was facing east. I was in the right place. The light started to come into the sky. We started to be able to see the reddish brown dirt of the mountain and the silvery green plants that grow no place else on earth. And so I'm facing the right direction and I'm waiting. Finally, light floods the sky, the kind of light that washes all the color out. And I see that thin line of sunrise start to come up over the ocean. So with all the light coming up and the light washing out everything, I suddenly heard this little sound behind me, this little, and so I turned for a minute and realized, oh my gosh, the glorious thing to see at sunrise at Haleakala is not to look east, but to look west, where the sky is blue and pink and purple and incredible. And I would have totally missed it if I hadn't heard that little voice of someone else noticing. I was looking in the wrong direction and I was unable to see what was unfolding all around me. When I was preparing for this sermon on Mark 13, this story about Mount Haleakala came to mind, and I began to wonder if that doesn't say something about why we struggle with apocalyptic or end-time texts like this one. Mark 13, 1 through 8 has been called the little apocalypse. Others say it's more of an anti-apocalypse, so listen and see what you hear. The story begins at the temple. Remember, we're in chapter 13. In the very next chapter, Jesus will begin Passion Week, the last week of his life. For now, Jesus and his disciples have been sitting in the temple, watching people put money into the treasury, including the poor widow who puts in the 2 mites of copper, the widow's mite story, and they talk about what real generosity is. Pay attention to the movement in this story and to where they are. So they come out of the temple, and the story picks up here. This is from Mark 13, 1 through 8. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." Listen to the movement once again. They leave the temple and go to the Mount of Olives across the valley from the temple, where they now have a very different perspective. The first conversation seems to have been in public, outside the temple. This next conversation seems to be a private one between Jesus and some of his followers. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." A little context here. The Gospel of Mark was written just after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. The temple was considered the stable center of the world. It surrounded the Holy of Holies, the quiet, still place where the finger of God held the world still. In a chaotic and dangerous world, this one place was still and safe. And around it, the temple was stable and safe. And around it, Jerusalem. And around it, Israel. You think things were heating up in the gospel stories. Well, in the year 70, the tensions between occupied Israel and their military occupying forces that had been seething under the surface erupted into what became known as the First Jewish Revolt against Rome. It didn't end well for the Jews. Jewish resistance was crushed. Jerusalem was a ruin. The temple was destroyed. So this place, the temple that they talk about in our passage, the one with such large stones and such large buildings, the one that looks so stable and safe and unchangeable, utterly destroyed. This passage looks back to that time and forward to that destruction. Jesus says, "Not one stone will be left here upon another. It will all be thrown down." If you listen closely, I think you can hear a lot of change and loss and uncertainty and grief in this text. Think about this. Most of the passage takes place at the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is a place where the bodies of Jewish people have been buried for more than 3,000 years. And after the revolt of 70 CE, there would have been even more buried there. All this is in the background of this multi-layered conversation. The world that the first century Jews like Jesus and his disciples had known is changing so fast. The people want an anchor. They want a fixed, unchanging point. What can you rely on in times like these? With this story, Mark is reorienting the early Christian community, decentering it in relationship to the temple and its rituals, and centering it in Jesus Christ. This is theology for a transitional time. When they were right outside the temple, it looked so monumental, it was hard to imagine something more solid to put your trust in. So Jesus takes them across the valley to gain some perspective. He tells them that things aren't always as they seem. The disciples, hardwired like us to want to know the future, ask for answers. When is this going to happen? Give us a sign. In very Jesus-like fashion, he does not give them a direct answer to their when and what questions. He doesn't give them what they want, but he does give them what they need, an invitation to think differently about the present so they can live differently into the future, to anchor their lives in God and what God is bringing into new life in the world, rather than the way things currently are or the way things have always been done. Now, it's true that you and I don't live in the same context that the first hearers of this story did. We just don't have the same reference points and shared understandings. Still, I can imagine that just like the people to whom these words were first addressed, it might be completely understandable that we might find ourselves looking in the wrong direction as the things that Jesus talks about begin to unfold. I mean, wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes and famines. Our attention can't help but be drawn there. It's no wonder we find ourselves facing the wrong direction, turning our focus away from what underlies it all, or from the larger future that these events have us all moving toward. The world we experience in hardship is still far from being an expression of the way God intends the world to be. And we're not promised an easy path, especially not in this passage. If you listen closely, I think you can hear a lot of change and loss and uncertainty and grief in our world. The world is changing so fast. People want an anchor. They want answers about when and what. They mourn the loss of the things they knew and thought they could rely on. So many things have changed, things that don't even seem to have anything to do with the church. People used to work at one employer their whole lives and had a retirement from that one place. Or people used to live their whole lives in one community, probably near their family. And family life looks very much different now. Both spouses probably have to work. Marriage looks different. Sacraments are more inclusive. Blended families are the norm. Your neighbors used to be Methodist or Catholic, and now they might be Hindu or Muslim. And the church is no longer at the center of community life. Where is God in all of this? Doctrine and Covenants 162, 2e says, "The spirit of the restoration is not locked in one moment of time, but is instead the call to every generation to witness to essential truths in their own language and form. Let the Spirit breathe." Mark assures us that our job as disciples is not to be experts at determining when the end of the world will come, but to be faithful followers of Christ right here and now. We're called to be open and attentive to what God is up to in our midst. This scripture passage begins in a temple already destroyed and continues in a graveyard with ominous tones. But perhaps the most important phrase in the entire passage is the last one. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Things are not always as they seem. What seems like change and loss and death and destruction is instead new life just breaking through. So often I find myself looking in the wrong direction and almost missing entirely what God is doing. When I was the pastor of a small congregation in California, I was constantly worried about and praying about the wrong things. I remember being really concerned about the music in our congregation. We had one elderly organist, and she was so faithful, but every year at our congregational business meeting, she would say, "I hope you're sending your children to piano lessons," but none of our kids were taking music lessons. And so she continued to play faithfully week after week, and we struggled. She struggled with some of the newer hymns and songs, and I continued to be worried about how we would grow and attract people without really great contemporary music. Always seeking feedback. One time at potluck, we were sitting around a table, and I asked the people at the table, "What's your favorite thing about church?" And people had different answers, but one person's answer, Gary, surprised me. Gary was the newest member of our congregation, and Gary was a recovering addict. And he was one of those people who says things like, "Jesus Christ saved my life," or "Our church is the bomb." And so when it came to Gary, Gary said, "My favorite thing about our congregation is the music." I was pretty surprised to hear that and asked him if he wanted to talk a little more about that. And he said, "You know, this is a place where everything isn't perfect. And because I'm not a perfect person, there's room for me in this church." That was so powerful for me. The thing I thought was the worst thing about our congregation was the open door that Gary walked through. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs, and God is at work in our midst. And our congregations and our shared life together is one of the places that we're most often looking in the wrong direction, seeing what we lack rather than what we have, seeing only death and decline and loss instead of noticing what God is up to and the new life that is being brought forth right under our noses. Birth is a painful and sometimes scary process, and its outcome is uncertain. But right now is an amazing time to be the church, because this is the direction we're called to look, not just over here where there's death and suffering and indifference, but everywhere. We have to be aware of those things, but we're called to look over here, to be continuously reading the signs of God at work in the world, loving, blessing, redeeming. The birth pangs are the signs that God is transforming the world, that God's kingdom is breaking into our own historical reality, changing our understandings of what will endure and what will not. We do not have a map, but God is our compass, Jesus Christ our fixed point. To think that we have pinpointed the coming of God's reign of justice is to have missed it. And to ignore the birth pangs altogether is to resist participation in the kingdom. Because the purpose of the watching and the waiting and the observing what God is up to in this world is to experience and be changed by something greater than we have ever known. Is to be transformed from the inside out, and to desire and work for that transformation for the entire creation, including people both closest to and farthest from us. So what is God birthing into new life around you? What change are you or your congregation grieving? And how might God be working in that or through it or even in spite of that change? What is it in your life or your congregation's life that looks like death and destruction but might just be the breaking in of new life? Maybe we're simply called to stay curious and open. Maybe we're called to always keep our hearts and minds open to what God may be doing through and around us. Without a doubt, we're called to remember with fervent hope that God is relentlessly birthing new life into the world, and that whatever the future may hold, God is already there, along with God's gift of grace and very presence. In fact, I imagine that's what we're called to be watching for all along.